Good afternoon, everyone. This is Margie McHugh from MPI's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy. I'd like to welcome you to this third in our series of webinars related to the creation of a national integration plan titled Cross-Cutting Needs and Opportunities, Language Access, Funding, Multi-Level Partnerships, and Planning for the Long Term. I know that's probably the clunkiest title ever for any event or webinar, but for those of you who have been following this work, you know that in the earlier webinars we tried to look a little more deeply at some of the population-specific issues or specific topics within or underneath sort of the integration umbrella. And then with this last in the series, we wanted to pull out and look at issues that cut across multiple integration subfields like language access and funding, and at the same time really acknowledge that there's some multi-level governance challenges here, and you know, to go a little bit more deeply into those. So for starters, let me just thank the three other presenters and leaders that have joined us for this. Nisha Agrawal, Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs for Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York City, Ku Wu, who is the Director of the Seattle Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for Mayor Ed Murray, and Charles Kamasaki, who has had a long and distinguished career with National Council of La Raza, the country's leading Latino civil rights policy and advocacy organization. So I'll just, before we begin, do some of the important housekeeping notes. You can see there the web address for getting slides and audio from today's webinar. Please definitely either call or email us, events@migrationpolicy.org, if you're having any trouble with the webinar platform. We encourage you to use the Q&A chat function throughout the webinar, because we'll be collecting your questions during the presentations, and so it's good to get your questions a bit in advance if possible. And also you can send an email to events@migrationpolicy.org with your questions. So let me just say a tiny bit as overview before we begin with our other speakers. Many of you are familiar with the different strands of our center's work in the integration field. You know that we've made some pretty big investments in research and policy analysis in education pipeline issues, also language access issues. Governance of integration policy has been a key concern of ours since our founding, but actually it's also a pretty big area of focus for Migration Policy Institute more generally. Our international program has helped many other countries set up what we call the better brain circuitry to connect their immigration policies with their immigrant integration policies. So offices of immigrant affairs or national offices to manage integration policy have been set up in Canada, Australia, Germany, Sweden, other countries in the EU, and MPI has been proud to be a very big part of that sort of work with those countries who are very concerned to make sure that they're learning in real time about what the impacts of their immigration policies are, and that they're making the investments that are needed in order to make sure that immigrants and refugees who are coming into their countries are able to succeed. So to set the stage for today's conversation, just a quick review of the work that we're talking about is all related to a presidential memorandum that was released by President Obama on November 21st last year as part of the larger set of executive actions that he took around immigration reform. The memorandum was entitled Creating Welcoming Communities and Fully Integrating Immigrants and Refugees. Many of the bedrock ideas that are there in the memorandum draw from prior proposals that have been made by MPI and others. It also very much mirrors H.R. 4949, the New American Success Act, that is a bipartisan bill that seeks to create a permanent staffed White House office that was introduced in the last Congress. And quite importantly for our purposes and for this series of webinars is that it establishes a White House task force on new Americans that's charged with reviewing the policies of all executive departments and agencies with regard to integration concerns, and developing a coordinated national integration strategy to better integrate new Americans and support state and local efforts to do the same. The task force is co-chaired by the Director of the Domestic Policy Council and the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, and I believe as many as 17 federal agencies and offices are specifically named as part of the task force. So the memorandum ordered the creation of a national integration plan within 120 days that is supposed to be submitted to the President. 120 days is pretty much this coming Friday, March 20th, as we understand from folks at the Domestic Policy Council. The plan would be released probably more like next week or before the end of the month, but it's very much in process. And then there was a public input process to creation of the plan. I believe almost 1,000 comments were received as part of that process. There was an interagency review process then of the comments that were submitted, and collaboration across a number of agencies around recommendations that are being made for the plan. And then, as many of you know, we created a new web page on MPI's website with background on the task force. And also, we appreciate that a number of groups let us post the recommendations that they made. We obviously weren't able to put up anywhere near all the recommendations or even remotely near, but we mainly asked groups that had covered a broad range of issue areas or that represented large networks of stakeholders that work on integration issues to allow us to post their recommendations. And in case you're not aware, we also posted recommendations from 4 mayor's offices. So we encourage you to look in particular at those. So speaking of mayor's offices, I'd like to introduce as our next speaker Nisha Agrawal, who's Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs in New York City. That is the first Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs created in the nation. It dates back to the early 1990s. It also is part now of the city charter that office should exist, and it addresses a wide range of immigration policy as well as integration programs that the city is involved in. And you'll see from Nisha's brief bio here that she's worked in a number of innovative public interest law organizations before being named commissioner, and so she brings a wide range of experiences from that field to her position. So Nisha, welcome, and please take it away.
Thanks so much, Margie, and thanks to everyone who's on the call and my fellow co-panelists. Really delighted to be presenting. So what I'm going to sort of talk through is some of the recommendations that we put forward as part of our contribution to the New Americans Task Force, and also share a little bit about what we've been thinking about in New York in terms of immigrant integration. And as Margie mentioned, New York City has the first Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, now part of the charter. And under Mayor de Blasio's leadership, we've really been growing a lot and sort of on a number of different citywide initiatives, like the launch of the city's municipal ID program called IDNYC, sort of in the throes of planning for implementation of executive action, which we are hopeful...
Closer to the phone?
Oh, sure. Which we are hopeful will be vindicated in the court. And essentially the vision for our office is to be a bridge between New York City's many very diverse immigrant communities and City Hall. And Mayor de Blasio has really made immigrant integration and immigrant rights a core aspect of his platform. So on a range...
Hello, is this better? In terms of the... I'll start over if I'm getting indications that the audio is not so great. Is this better?
Much better.
Okay, good. So I'll just quickly say that I'm delighted to be on this. The New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs is essentially a bridge between New York City's more than 3 million foreign-born immigrant residents and City Hall. And Mayor de Blasio has really made immigrant integration and immigrant rights a core aspect of his platform. And indeed, one of the major initiatives we've been working on, IDNYC, was one of his key commitments that he made during the campaign and now as mayor, which launched recently. So what what I'm going to share briefly is just some of the recommendations that we put forward to the New Americans Task Force, and start by saying that these are recommendations that the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs put forward, but really we've been working with a range of different city agencies, our legal services and community-based providers, philanthropic partners, a kind of full cross-section of New York City, and putting together not only these recommendations, but really the work that we've been doing on immigrant integration for the last several years. So first, I'll start. New York City has been thinking about immigrant integration in a wide variety of ways, sort of innovative programs around English language access and training, from funding actual programs to innovative television shows like the We Are New York program to encourage English language acquisition. Some really interesting work happening out of our Department of Small Business Services and Department of Consumer Affairs on financial empowerment and linking that to programs like citizenship, which we've been very actively involved with. Also some interesting programs around business and entrepreneurial support, immigration legal assistance that New York City and the City Council have been really active in the last few years. Basic assistance around navigating city services and language access has been a priority in an area that I've personally worked on for many years. And of course, just making sure that immigrant New Yorkers are aware of their rights to what they can access in city government and beyond. So we've really been thinking about integration in a full panoply of ways and working with our partners both within government and outside of government to make a variety of these different initiatives real on the ground. And one example of this is language access. So New York City over the years has developed a series of progressive laws on language access. One of the original local laws was Local Law 73, which focused on health and human services agencies. And then there are a couple of executive orders on language access that require essentially all city agencies with public contact to provide interpretation and translation services for New Yorkers who need it. And also other laws that impact the healthcare setting, for example, language access in the pharmacy context that have really been, we think, leading the way in terms of the role that local governments have in ensuring that limited English proficient New Yorkers can access their city services on equal terms to everyone else. And one of the things that we've really been thinking about in our work along these lines is how do we go beyond just the interpretation and translation, which of course is critical, but also think about our outreach campaigns in a very multilingual way. And this sort of in the last year we've done in a couple of different ways. One, when the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was being renewed, we launched a multilingual transit and media ad campaign just to let New Yorkers know about DACA renewal and about DACA in the first place, and also did the same with the launch of our municipal ID program, really making sure that bus and subway ads and ad buys were also in community and ethnic media, really the venues in which people access their information, and we've seen a significant uptake in these programs as well as in calls to our 311 phone hotline from non-English speaking New Yorkers as a result of some of this multilingual outreach. So our approach to language access has really been from putting in place some strong laws, ensuring that city agencies are improving their policies and programs to provide interpretation and translation, and then going beyond that to really thinking about outreach and engagement with community and ethnic media to truly reach the millions of New Yorkers who are foreign-born and may prefer to speak a language other than English. And one of our recommendations, one would of course be the need for, I think, additional federal support and financial support for language access programs, particularly as our country and our cities get more diverse, to really have some of the support that we need on the ground to make these programs real. And in addition, for us as cities to sort of think about how do we better disseminate best practices and resources for some particularly challenging areas to provide language access. In New York, for example, there's a large focus on mental health and the need for improved access to mental health services, and often language is a significant barrier there, and bridging the language gap in those contexts may be more challenging than even in others that we see them. So that's been one of our main recommendations or focus areas. Another area that we've really been trying to think creatively is on public education campaigns, and I mentioned a little bit of this before in the context of language access, but we have, with respect to executive action and programs like DACA, as well as with municipal ID, really thinking about how do we leverage the incredible assets that we have in New York City with our faith community, with our really robust community-based organization network, with civic leaders and other organizations that maybe aren't focused on immigrant communities but nevertheless serve many different immigrant communities, social service providers, et cetera, and especially our public library system, which is one of the kind of safest and most accessible places for immigrant New Yorkers to get their information. So how do we really engage those different partners in getting the word out about the different programs that the city is running that are open and accessible to immigrant New Yorkers? And that's, in the context of our ID program has proven to be quite successful. For almost a year before launch, we were engaging in community-based discussions, outreach with many of these different partners in multiple languages, again, multilingual ad campaigns and ad buys. And, what we've seen with the ID program, for example, is that in about 2 months, more than 300,000 people have signed up for appointments to get the ID card. 70,000 people have already enrolled in the program. And the vast majority of these people were not collecting information on immigration status, but we are on the ground and sort of have seen immigrant New Yorkers and non-English speaking New Yorkers come forward in really huge numbers, more so than has happened before. And we do think this has to do with a very conscious effort on thinking about public education so that it really reaches all of the different immigrant New Yorkers across the city in a language that they can understand. And so our sort of recommendation to the New Americans Task Force was to really think about this kind of collaboration with local and state partners as well as community-based partners to identify the relevant immigrant communities and also the leaders who can really amplify a message and start getting the conversation going sooner and not thinking that, a single one-size-fits-all approach will work to reach some of the immigrant communities, and very happy to talk through some of the specifics of what we've done in different campaigns. A third example that I wanted to share with everyone is around workforce development. So New York City is right now going through a major rethink and restructuring of our workforce system. And into the mix of that, we're really thinking about how immigrant New Yorkers' needs in the workforce system can really be lifted up and integrated into the planning. And we're lucky in that some of our agencies, like the Economic Development Corporation and Small Business Services, have over the years really developed innovative programs to support immigrant job seekers and business owners. That includes this year, Small Business Services launching an immigrant resource toolkit in different languages to really help augment the services that staff at workforce development centers offer, and running classes now in the 5 boroughs in languages other than English, based very directly on feedback from the community that 2/3 of small business owners in New York City are immigrants, and our workforce programs weren't really meeting their needs and not meeting their needs in a language that was relevant to them. So really starting to change that dynamic with some of this new programming, and also beginning to collect more data on what it is that immigrant job seekers need support with so that we can design our workforce programs to be responsive to them. An area we're exploring now and really think could be explored nationwide and as part of our recommendations is to think about the role of community-based organizations and worker centers that serve the immigrant community in workforce engagement and trainings and programming in a more robust way. And then finally, some of our additional recommendations revolved around the need for federal funding and support for many different local and state efforts around centralized information in different languages, and also just sort of support in figuring out how we can help immigrant communities best navigate the array of services that are available to them. We're looking at things like how do we make our web page more accessible, how do we get information out in sort of guidebooks around what services are available, but we're kind of starting, even in New York, without any kind of clear resources for people to figure out what kind of English language classes are available for them, what are the different sort of workforce programs that may be accessible to them. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of navigation, and we think that support from the federal government and being able to accomplish some of that would be enormously helpful. And in addition, we've been organizing with cities around the country on citizenship issues as well as executive action, and would really love to continue having regular conversations with sister cities around the country about immigrant integration and how do we all learn from each other's best practices, and then also start to lift up the local voices that are doing the work on the ground to the national level, so that we can start to move the national dialogue. So this is for our other cities that are on the call, really an invitation to continue talking about these issues and how we can organize around them.
Great, thanks so much, Nisha. And we did see that a number of the cities and other levels of government were suggesting that the task force should continue to speak with them about, because this will be at least a year-long process in terms of implementation of the integration plan. So folks, if you have questions, please send them in to events@migrationpolicy.org. And now I would like to introduce Ku Vu, the Director of Seattle's Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. As you can see, she brings experience from her lived experience as a refugee growing up in the U.S. and also a wide range of positions, mostly at the federal level. We were sorry to lose her from the D.C. area, where she had worked at the Department of Labor, in organized labor, also with the Human Rights Campaign. But of course, our loss is Seattle's gain as she takes on a wide range of immigrant and refugee issues for the city of Seattle. So, Ku, over to you. Ku, make sure you unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you for that reminder. Hello, everybody. This is Ku. I thank you for the gracious introduction, Margie. And I've been in this role since October. Oh, no, I'm sorry. God, it seems like a long time. August of 2014, which is about 14 timesheets between now and today. And we, as Margie mentioned, previously I was doing more of advocacy at the national level. I wasn't quite sure what it would be like to do immigration work at a municipal level, but I can tell you that it's been some of the most rewarding work I've ever done, because this is where you get to put policy and ideas and concepts into practice, and with a progressive mayor like Ed Murray and a really progressive city council, there's just a lot of ability to think about what we need to do and then put those ideas into motion. So it's really, I want to acknowledge Nisha and Charles, fellow panelists who I've worked with and have gotten to know over the years, and to be able to join them today in this panel. So getting started, just a couple of quick things about Seattle. We have about 180,000 residents in the state who are eligible to be naturalized. Only about 40% of them naturalize in a given year. And Washington is also the 8th largest refugee receiving state. 1 out of nearly 5 residents are foreign-born in the city. And we have about 129 languages that are spoken in Seattle public schools. And as you can see, immigrants and refugees from our city come primarily from Asian countries, but a good distribution among the other countries listed here on this infograph. Some of the more recent refugee arrivals are from countries where there's been a lot of government unrest and civil war. And for some folks who are coming to the U.S., they've spent decades in refugee camps without any formal education. So they arrive in the city, many of them even illiterate in their own language. So you can imagine the high services that these refugee populations need. And you can see a little bit here of the distribution we've had over the 5-year period between 2007 and 2012. More recently, we've been getting refugee arrivals from Congo and other countries. And so you take a look at the top 20 foreign languages that are spoken in Seattle schools. You can see here that some of these languages are actually very difficult to serve, and some of the language services companies that many of you all use, whether in the city or organizations that you work with, traditionally Spanish and Cantonese and other languages would be offered, but it's very difficult to find, for example, Somali, Amharic, Oromo, and Tigrinya, which are some of the languages that we need to serve. So Margie asked us to share a little bit about how we came up with the recommendations for the White House Task Force. And what I'm sharing with you here is just it was a collaborative process that was very tight, if you will, involving a few key stakeholders who worked very closely with us on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis. And this is, we were able to come up with a set of recommendations on a very short notice for two reasons. One is because we're part of the mayor's cabinet and work very closely, and he's developed there a new Office of Policy and Innovation. So there is a policy staffer associated with every city department. So you can imagine 28 city departments, there are policy staff that are liaisons to each city department. So when we work closely with OPI, we essentially have contact with all city departments without having to go directly to those departments themselves. We also work closely with the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs because there's so many layers to immigration policy, from city to state to federal, and then obviously general counsel to take a look at those issues that have legal implications. And what makes all of this possible for us to work with this very small, cohesive team is that not only are we staffed to drive programs, for example, citizenship and language access, which I'll get into in the next slide, but we also have a consulting role across the city, which is, when there's a conversation about the city's future, whether it's what's Seattle going to be like in the next 20 years, which is a body of work that we're trying to undertake right now under what's called a comp plan, or Seattle 2035. We're there at the table to make sure that immigrant refugee voices are part of those conversations and so forth, from preschool to environmental justice. We're actively sought out in these conversations and actively participate. So it gives us the ability to be able to talk about immigrant refugee issues across the entire city with knowledge about what's happening in those cities there on a deep level. We came up with a quite lengthy document, about 10 or 11 pages. And, if anybody wants to have at it, you can take a look at the MPI website that Margie mentioned. But when we really thought about, what are the priority issues that we want to put in front of the White House Task Force, we distilled it down to, if there was nothing else that we could talk about, there were three things that we call the three rails of integration. And these are, for our city, the most important. And the first two, citizenship and civic engagement and English fluency, are really because they're economic issues for immigrants and refugees. We know that citizenship plays a strong role in influencing the wages of immigrants and refugees who become naturalized. And there's research that shows that over a lifetime, naturalized immigrant or refugee makes on average like 11% more than their non-naturalized counterparts. And then with English fluency, there's research that shows that there's a strong correlation between job mobility and English fluency. So those are very much important to the mayor's vision and the work that we do in our office around immigrant integration. And then obviously those things plug into the mayor's vision of the city, Seattle, becoming a very strong city around equity issues. On language access, we, as much as, we're trying to kind of push the needle and move the needle around self-sufficiency for immigrants and refugees in our city, it stands to reason that a lot of the barriers that exist for immigrants and refugees in Seattle are linguistic in nature. So as I mentioned, about 129 languages are spoken in our public schools. About almost 40% of immigrants and refugees, according to recent research that we've looked at, say that they don't speak English very well. And then almost a third of immigrant refugee households are what we describe as linguistically isolated. So it stands, that if we're really going to do our job of addressing equity and serving all residents of Seattle, language access needed to be a big part of our plan. So we've come up with a new citizens program. A new citizens program that's been in existence for about since 1996. and then a new voting rights task force that will be released in probably the next 2 or 3 weeks. We're happy to share that with anybody who wants to take a look at it. And attached to those recommendations will be a proposed Seattle Votes campaign to really engage immigrant refugee voters in the city. We developed this year a ready-to-work program that focuses on ESL and computers for the lowest levels of English speakers in our city. That's measured through CASAS levels 1, 2, 3. And these are the folks that have ambitions to learn English specifically for finding a job or a better job. They don't have time for college through the community college system, and the needs that they have around workforce issues extend beyond the life skills curricula that a lot of CBOs offer. So this will be launched in June of this year with community development block grant money from HUD in addition to Workforce Development Council money, and then we've just put in an application for a Wells Fargo U.S. Conference of Mayors grant in their Community Wins program. And then we have a 5-year ambitious consistent language or ambitious program to provide consistent language access standards and looking at 3 levels of language access: interpretation, which has been part of our city ordinance for the last decade under Mayor Nichols. But we recognize that the time now, we're well beyond those 6 p.m. town halls in the evenings and translated materials, that we need to bump it up and really think about how to use translation and community engagement at a much more effective level to bring folks in to the conversation. So the recommendations that we provided to the White House in these 3 areas are pretty straightforward. Citizenship, as everybody knows, the fee is a prohibitive cost, and we hear often that people don't apply because they just can't afford it. So we'd like to see the White House move towards allowing a fee waiver or some fee reduction for low-income applicants and seniors. Here locally, we're also hearing that there's been high rates of denials for applicants who need the disability waiver. So we'd like to see some investigation in this and what other, whether this is a problem that is experienced in other cities around the country, and whether there are systemic issues that we need to look at within the USCIS process. Around English language proficiency, we'd like to see that the White House support innovative adult ESL programming at the local level and really focus on the lowest levels of ESL, where we see a really strong persistence in unemployment and underemployment. And these are the hardest to serve communities. So a city investment there would be really bolstered by state and federal support as well. And then echoing Nisha's recommendations around language access, we'd love to do more quarterly calls with other offices with the White House to take a look at this. Not only for the things that she mentioned, but also for us to really explore the idea of even developing language access standards so that it's really more consistent from city to city. We don't have those kind of wide variations, or because, workers move and families often move, and it would be nice to be able to give people a more consistent experience across government. And then there are a couple of other issues that Margie asked. I don't want to touch on all 5 of them. Let me just quickly touch on a couple of these. Under law enforcement, wage theft is something that is a problem here in the city, and we know that this is an issue that affects primarily, or I shouldn't say primarily, but disproportionately undocumented immigrants who are the most vulnerable to these crimes. We'd love for the White House to support local public safety programming like the Refugee Women's Institute, which we did last year, and it brought together women police officers with refugee women to discuss public safety challenges in their communities and to develop local refugee leaders. And then lastly, the child care assistance. There are a lot of immigrants and refugees who need assistance in supporting their families while they're working, and Seattle provides a child care assistance subsidy for low-income residents, which could be expanded so that everyone eligible could receive the assistance. The problem is that the Federal Child Care and Development Fund helps low and moderate income families with the cost of child care and increases the availability and quality of that care. States contributing matching resources for a portion of the CCDF funding they receive, but currently, federal and state funding for child care assistance falls well short of the need, and only a small share of young children receive federally funded child care subsidies. We know that the Obama administration's expansion of this child care program, it means that an additional 1 million additional young children will be supported, and states are required to develop plans to build care for infants and toddlers. With mayor's offices across the country and state governments, we'd like to participate in quarterly calls to ensure that immigrant and refugee child care providers are supported in transitioning through this process and receiving the credentialing they need to maintain the standards required by the state. So that's kind of a quick snapshot, Margie, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great, Koo. Thank you so much. And I think that last issue you went into gives everybody a good idea of the depths that that you all delved into the issues on. And so you know, again, I would recommend to folks that they really look at what Seattle and New York submitted. We didn't get much into the human services recommendations more generally that both of you had on your agenda, which actually Boston did as well. But anyway, lots to get through here. So thanks to those of you who have already sent in some questions. Remember, you can do it either through the chat box there on the screen or at events@migrationpolicy.org. So now I'd like to turn it over to Charles Kamasaki, who, as I said, is the Senior Cabinet Advisor at the National Council of La Raza. He has had a hand in really just decades worth of research, policy analysis, and advocacy on a range of issues there at NCLR. So we're delighted to have him with us also today to give his perspective. And while he may look a little impatient, maybe even disinterested in that photo, it was not taken today. And I can say that he's looking relaxed, and he's even cracking a smile right now. So, Charles, it's great to have you with us and to benefit from just the incredible work you've been doing on all these issues for so long. Welcome.
Well, geez. After that introduction, Margie, I was going to start with a bunch of by praising MPI for all of its work, but after that introduction, I'm not sure whether I should say that. No, but seriously, I very much appreciate the invitation, really applaud MPI for doing this webinar series, but more importantly, for really nurturing the immigrant integration issue from being virtually off the radar screen to, I think, increasingly at the front of the nation's policy agenda. So what I'd like to do today very briefly is really go from the specific to the general, or from the micro to the macro, if you will. So I will be running through very quickly a few of the slides, laying out some broad themes, and then returning to those themes later on. So first, I would note that MPI itself submitted very detailed recommendations. NCLR endorsed those, but rather than repeating all of them specifically, just tried to fill in some gaps, and I'll give you a couple of examples that are, as I say, more illustrative than actually definitive. But I think if you step back and look at the totality of the recommendations that were submitted by a broad range of actors, I think there are some conclusions that are pretty clear. One of those is that the scope and depth of these recommendations really do demonstrate the need for sustained policy intervention. You've heard some of that already from Koo and Nisha. It also, it seems to me, requires quite substantial engagement from both the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. And while I think many people look at the turn of the 20th century as something very different or something very distant, I will argue at the end that, in fact, our current situation really in many ways resembles that which our forebears faced and which successfully addressed 100 years ago. So one example really of a kind of intervention that could make sense along language access lines does involve health promotion. And as noted, whether it's talking about whether one is talking about signing up for health insurance coverage or trying to do a broad public health campaign, say around a flu or a chronic disease like diabetes, it's often true that it is critical to integrate, not just to offer those services in languages other than English, but also in ways that are culturally competent. A similar example relates to an area that is not often talked about, which is financial services. So everything from counseling to prevent people from being taken advantage of by predatory lending schemes to enforcement programs to follow up on violations often are not particularly immigrant-friendly and require some policy intervention. Margie mentioned that one of the areas we were interested in talking about was funding, and you've heard from both Ku and Nisha the need for increased federal support. And while we would absolutely support that from an NCLR perspective, we also believe there are ways to better align existing funding across all levels of government to better serve the purpose of integrating immigrants into society. And so we made a recommendation, something along the lines of the Promise Zone program, or some may also remember the so-called Race to the Top program, which required substantial investment by states and localities, and which were then rewarded by also substantial federal investments. And the idea, we think, is that one is not necessarily just dependent on more funding, but through these kinds of funding mechanisms can better align existing funding in ways that get you a bigger bang for the buck. Finally, Margie mentioned the importance of governance, and that's obviously one that we share. We believe that while the president's executive order is important and the new White House office is a real landmark, we at NCLR believe that we need a permanent office, eventually with a statutory authorization to fully implement these over the long term. And so returning back to the where I started, many historians look back at the turn of the last century as exemplifying one of the most successful social policy experiments ever anywhere in the world. Literally, over a fifth of the American population was foreign-born, and in the course of a couple of decades, really, I guess 3 or 4 decades, we integrated this massive wave of immigrants virtually fully into the American mainstream. We think that with the right kinds of policy interventions, the right kinds of nonprofit and philanthropic engagement, we can replicate that, notwithstanding the enormous differences between previous populations and the previous policy environments and the current ones. And just as a reminder to close, many people, I think, misremember the history of the last major wave of immigration to this country. And the thinking is that people stepped off the boat at Ellis Island, immediately learned English, and immediately became part of the middle class. In fact, some enormous policy interventions were required to help accommodate that new population, including, for the first time, universal public education. The birth of the modern, of the adult education system occurred during that period. From the nonprofit sector, we all know about the role that settlement houses played, as well as the lesser-known roles of unions. And finally, from the philanthropic sector, this period was also accompanied by really the opening up of literacy to the broader population, including immigrants, in part through Andrew Carnegie and the establishment of the modern public library system. So my point is we have never in this country relied solely on the market or on immigrants themselves to integrate themselves into society. That has always been substantially facilitated both by policy intervention, by engagement of civic society, as well as very substantial philanthropic support.
Terrific, Charles. Thank you. Very big picture there, and also great sort of scope of history around these issues. So I'm just going to breeze quickly through three areas of recommendations from MPI that I just wanted to make sure were on the table here. As I said in my introduction, that MPI has been involved with a number of other countries that have been setting up better brain circuitry and management of their integration policies, sort of seeing it as the other half of the coin to their immigration policies. So at the same time, I think what a lot of other countries have more of a discourse around is the idea of whole of government approaches. There started to be a big discourse around that in the UK, Canada, and Australia dating back to the early 1990s. Now many European countries are speaking in that way about the fact that in government generally we've built many stovepipes, that so many of the things that we do to address different service needs or social challenges exist in these stovepipes, when in fact we really need cross-cutting approaches across those stovepipes. And so in order to get there, what many of the countries that are experimenting with whole of government approaches are doing is aligning as a bedrock step forward, aligning goals, targets, outcomes, accountability, and the like across those different areas. And so obviously, this is the sort of thing that we're talking about here with brain circuitry around integration. And so one of the key recommendations we made, just as an overarching point in our submission, was that especially if we're hoping to look ahead to the formal creation of a White House office on immigrant integration via legislation, that it would be very productive over the course of the next year for the members of the task force to create integration goals and indicators for each of their agencies, so that we really have a framework for these efforts as we look ahead, demonstrating the great good that could come from being much more intentional about integration policy. And then I'll just make a very narrow point about that from a data point of view, but it's quite important. A number of folks for a while now have been pointing out that if we could have parental place of birth within the American Community Survey, it would be a really important starting point for many agencies and public stakeholders to be able to really understand integration outcomes much better. Then language access, we've spoken about. I think all three of the speakers have addressed it in one form or another, so I won't say much about the problem here. The only thing I wanted to point out was that this is another one of those areas where there's really no one-off solution. There's so much complexity in terms of the ways in which one has to structure delivery of language access services at the agency level and at the frontline service level. And there's the changing nature of the challenge, given the different languages and levels of ability of speaker literacy and the like of speakers coming in. So really, what we need is more of a process between the federal government and state and local agencies, so that business around these issues can be transacted on a more regular basis. And so, we think another important sort of overarching, right from the get-go recommendation is that there should be a cross-agency working group involving federal agencies. They themselves have their own responsibilities around language access, but really an interface with state and local governments, because that's the only way to really get at some of the solutions that would be of benefit to states and localities. Things that, for example, would allow for some sort of better use of technology. There's a lot of technology being developed, for example, in the Defense Department that hasn't made its way over for more domestic purpose uses, group purchasing as a way for folks to save money at the state and local level, et cetera. So just an ongoing sort of mechanism for transacting business around those issues. And then again, I think we've all spoken in one way or another about funding from the federal government. So we refer to that as an Integration Success Fund. Many of you who follow our work know that we've been pointing out that most taxes paid by immigrants and refugees go to the federal government, while most service costs are borne by state and local governments. That's been established in the research since the 1990s. we've also been pointing out that there's almost $60 billion in suspended wages in the Social Security Administration that cannot be paid out. It's been paid in on behalf of unauthorized workers for the most part. And we believe that that could be the beginning, some portion of that, if workers are prevented from having access to that money going forward as they currently are, that or some other source of funding. For example, a small additional amount that could be charged, for example, on fees to USCIS. That there's a number of ways to create and fund an integration success fund. But most importantly, we just think we have to find a way to start talking about that, to not be caught unprepared when we get to the point of immigration reform legislation, that instead a lot of the questions about how should a fund like that be structured, what should be the role or the access of states versus local agent entities to that funding, what could the funding be used for? How would it exist sort of parallel or integrated with other federal funds that come down for, say, adult education and training? An awful lot of issues to consider here. So we were suggesting that right away there should be a cross-agency working group formed to explore some of these options, to provide recommendations for the creation and implementation of such a fund, because it's a fairly complex thing to do, and really the time is now to get started on speaking about it. So with that, we're going to move to some of the questions that folks have submitted, and I wanted to start with a few questions in the language access arena. One of the questions is how might the federal government become more coordinated across agencies around language access issues? And what could that look like? Is there any model for it? And then also questions around multilingual websites. What's the role of either multilingual websites at the federal government or at the local level? So, Charles, I might pitch the sort of cross-agency language access one to you, because I know that La Raza did a lot of work around with FEMA when there was the concern that a lot of the disaster response was lacking in language access, and folks at that point pointed out that FEMA, by contracting in a sense or sending money down to states and localities for disaster preparation, that sort of a key to more coordination around language access, since disaster preparation cuts across agencies. So, what might this look like, I guess, in terms of just better federal agency coordination? And then Nisha and Ku, I'll send it to you for the multilingual websites. How much do you use them? Is there overlap between what you do and the federal government? How much of a help are they from a language access perspective?
So I guess I would answer that in two ways. One is specifically the question about disaster relief. We began working on that issue in the wake of Katrina, when it was very clear that the very substantial Latino population affected in the Gulf Coast states was essentially unable to access almost any of the services that were being offered, in part because of a lack of language access. One might contrast that to the federal response to the H1N1 virus early in the Obama administration, when there was really quite a successful public educational campaign then. And I think, which leads me to my second point, which was, I think it's simply a matter of somebody making the point that it is important to reach all segments of the population. And I think it happened in the latter and not in the former. One would hope that were there a permanent White House office focused on these issues, that would be part of the job description.
Great. Nisha or Ku, on the multilingual website questions?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So this is something we're actually focusing on right now just in terms of New York City's own websites and, frankly, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs website, which we would like to make more multilingual than it is. And we've learned from some of our programs, like our Municipal ID program, which is, for example, has an online appointment system, and the difference that it makes in actually having that in both Spanish and Chinese, for example, which are the top two languages spoken by LEP New Yorkers in terms of participation in our program. We also know that doing the translations really is a significant undertaking for agencies. It's not an easy thing to pull off, certainly in multiple different languages. And so some of it, I think, to really happen requires centralized coordination and support, which our office is sort of structured to provide for other agencies as they're thinking through this. So our hope is that we start by being the model to other cities, to other agencies in terms of our own website, which we're overhauling, and then we'll be in a position to really make sure that the city overall provides multilingual language access at website portals, especially as more and more city business is happening online, but it's still very much a work in progress.
Thanks, Nisha. Ku, did you want to jump in on that? Oh, Ku, I think you're muted again. Huh? Okay. So I'm going to move ahead with some other questions since it seems like we're having trouble hearing from Ku right now. So let me just warn again, Nisha and Ku, that there was also a question about whether and to what extent cities are coordinating with state governments on integration issues. And then we got a pretty extensive question via email talking about refugee funding and how it was negatively impacted last year. Some of you who follow refugee issues may know that because of the crisis at the border with unaccompanied children and family members coming in, there was a great deal of uncertainty since money for those services was coming out of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. There was a big delay in payments to states. A number of states were threatening to pull out of refugee resettlement. At the same time that new populations, such as Congolese and soon potentially Syrians, were coming in. And so, you know, states did cut some states cut services. This particular question was coming from Illinois, where some of those services were cut, and it's a state that's facing bigger budget cuts and where the governor has not put into this year's budget some particularly important linguistic and cultural competence navigation services that have been provided for many years by community-based organizations. So I would say that definitely the concern that the writer had was that refugee resettlement issues sometimes get lost within the larger scope of immigrant integration issues. We do have a number of inputs made to the White House Task Force that came from, for example, the state coordinators of refugee resettlement and some of the large refugee resettlement agencies. And folks can also listen to the webinar on those issues from last week. But one of the things I would say from MPI's point of view is that we made a recommendation that particularly when it came to education and training for refugees, that especially as we move into the new age of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, it certainly appears that for just the same amount of very limited money, that the system is going to be expected to produce much higher outcomes, more transitions to post-secondary education, for example. And the big fear, and I think it's a very warranted one, is that the ferocious creaming that we already see in terms of the ability of low-educated and limited English proficient individuals to access education and training, that will only get worse under WIOA. And that this is a particular concern for refugees, where we've already heard over the last several years that there's real reluctance on the part of a lot of programs to even enroll refugees because of the fear that they won't progress well, that it'll hurt the bottom line of programs, that programs might lose their contracts. And so in our recommendations, we said that we thought since this is a federally mandated program, and that these are, that these individuals are in state and local communities as a result of international agreements that the U.S. government has made, and because we don't want to see refugees trapped in poverty, moved very quickly off of public benefits. The only standard is really the self-sufficiency standard is simply being off of public benefits. That there's a real danger of refugees being resettled into permanent poverty, and that therefore the State Department, Health and Human Services, we believe, should be much more closely evaluating refugees' education and training needs and paying states and localities to support refugees in attaining education and training that aligns with them making a family, entering a family wage sustaining job, that education and training for refugees really matters, and that we really have to find a way to pay for it so that they really have the opportunity for long-term integration success. So with that, anybody who'd like to comment on that, you certainly should. And otherwise, Ku, do you want to take a whack at the question about city and state coordination? Or also, I think we lost you as we were talking about language access issues earlier.
Yeah, I apologize, Margie. I pressed the wrong button and accidentally hung up you guys. On language access, I will just say really quickly that we have an ambitious citywide plan that we will implement over the next 5 years. And to the extent that this might be a template for how we would look at federal agencies working together, we realized that there needed to be a point person in each city department. So I also think that that's true for the federal government, that there needs to be one person who's in charge of language access, who wakes up every day thinking about it. Short of that, it's just really hard to kind of get the traction and the attention and effort that we need for within these very large structures. So that's going to take some effort, but if it's mandated, which I know in San Francisco there's city law that requires it. Here we're exploring the possibility of doing such a thing, going through our city council to pass that kind of legislation. So it would give the programming more teeth, if you will. And so I would, wonder aloud whether we might want to do something like that at the federal level.
Great, thanks, Ku. I do want to remind folks, and this also came in as a gentle prod, I'll say, from one of the listeners saying that that we should remind everyone that there are language access requirements that entities who receive federal assistance need to comply with, and so definitely we would want to reiterate that. I think that the conversation here around language access was more that the federal government should do more than just say "thou shalt" to its state and local partners, and instead should find ways to assist them, since language access need is being generated by federal immigrant and refugee policies of the federal government, and that there are ways that the federal government, without necessarily additional expense to itself, or significant additional expense, can help states and localities meet their language access goals and requirements. So I'm afraid that's all the time we have right now. I know we have a few unanswered questions, but we'd be, we'll follow up with those of you who have unanswered questions via email. You'll see here on the screen now that you can email those of us who were on the call just now. A few of you asked if you could see some of the resources that were mentioned by some of the speakers, and there are, websites, and there you see email addresses. So I would say feel free to be in touch with the speakers, and then we'd really welcome any suggestions you all may have. We're putting together our plans for work that we'll be doing with folks in the field and here in DC once the integration plan is announced by the White House. So we look forward to circling back with a lot of you then. But in the meantime, thanks so much to Charles, Ku, and Nisha for the terrific presentations today, also for the great recommendations that they submitted to the White House Task Force. And thanks to all of you for listening. And we're probably, I would say, as excited as you are to see what comes out with the plan. And so, you know, looking forward to reconnecting with you around that. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Margie.